if you love dynamic attacking chess, the Benko Gambit is your new best friend. In this video, I'll teach you how to play the Benko Gambit with the black pieces. Move by move, every plan, every trap, every idea. This is designed especially for beginners to club players, so let's begin. So, d4, knight f6, c4 and now c5, also known as the Benoni defense. White goes for pushing the pawn to d5, which is the main move to keep an edge. If white goes for capturing the pawn on c5, black can already push the pawn to e6, capture the pawn with the bishop, castle up, play b6, develop the bishop on b7 and strike with d5. Black's all pieces are now developed, striking in the center, and black is already able to equalize the position, and black is pretty happy. So going back, white goes for pushing up the pawn on d5, keeping an edge, and now we push the pawn to b5, also known as the Benko Gambit, sacrificing the pawn for free, and now playing the move a6, sacrificing another pawn and now capturing with the bishop. Now we are officially a pawn down with the black pieces, but in the exchange now we are having much better development on the queen side, whereas white's all pieces are still on the back rank. So after bishop cross a6, white develops the knight and we push the pawn to d6, keeping a healthy pawn structure. White develops another knight and now we play the move g6, with the idea of fianchetting the bishop on g7, keeping the bishop on a good diagonal. And now white is having majorly two options to continue the position. If you are going to play the Benko Gambit, these are the most two common ideas, which is e4 and g3. Starting with g3, the idea is same, developing the bishop to g2. We develop the bishop, white does the same, we castle up, white castles up, and now we develop the final minor piece, knight b to d7. And now white simply plays rook to e1, just moving the rook from this bishop's diagonal, which makes sense. And now we are going to play the move queen to a5, developing the queen on the queen side. So basically the idea in the Benko Gambit is to get both the rooks on the queen side, the queen on the queen side, and try to pressurize the pawn on a and the b pawn. And eventually with putting some high pressure on the queen side, eventually the pawn falls and black is already a pawn up in the endgame thanks to the pawn on c5. So after queen a5, white is having many options. Let's start with e4, pushing up the pawn in the center, which makes sense. Just pushing up the pawn, having a good center control. And now we play the move knight to g4. The idea is pretty simple. We are trying to open up the dark square bishop, and the idea is to get the g4 knight to e5. And thanks to the pawn on e4, you can see the bishop on a6 currently defends the square on d3. So somehow, if I'm able to put the knight on d3, I would be able to attack the rook and also the bishop. So that's the idea. Put the knight on e5 and jump on the d3 square. White plays h3, we go back with the knight to e5, we have a knight trade, and white plays a4, just a waiting move. Knight goes to d3, attacking the rook. The rook has to move, and now we simply chop off the bishop. And after queen c1, you see the bishop on c1 was the main defender to protect the b2 pawn. But as the bishop is gone, after rook f to b8, you see, now we are simply going to put some good pressure on the pawn on b2. The idea is pretty simple. We can put the rook on b4, get another rook to b8, attack the pawn on b2, and black is a pawn down, but black is very happy. It's very easy to play with black. White is having lots of weaknesses in the position, and eventually by putting some extra pressure on the pawn on b2, white is going to collapse and black is pretty happy. Going back, that's exactly what happens if white goes for playing the move e4. Now going back, if white tries to go for playing the move bishop to d2, which makes sense, putting some pressure on the queen on a5, we'll simply go back with the queen. As there is no bishop on c1 anymore, the b2 pawn is hanging. White have to protect it, so white plays queen c2, developing the queen, protecting the pawn. We just use our final rook, getting all the pieces into the game, attacking the b2 pawn. And for example, white is like, okay, let me push the pawn to b3, which makes sense, and this is a move which you are definitely going to face if you are playing the Benko Gambit. White pushes the pawn, and now we are going to seize this moment and going to strike with c4. c4 is a typical idea you need to remember whenever white plays b3. Even if white do not play b3, this is a typical idea with c4, knight to c5, because c5 square is a good square for the knight. We can push the pawn to c4, If white doesn't take, we are very happy to take. So let's say white takes it, and after bishop cross c4, still the a pawn is hanging, the d5 pawn is weak, and once again black is pretty happy. We can play rook to c8, putting pressure on the queen. Once again, it's very easy to play with black. The bishop on g7 on the dark square has now opened up as there is no b2 pawn. Black is very happy and much better. Going back, that's exactly what happens if bishop to d2. Now if white goes for playing the move h3, which makes sense, simply taking control of the g4 square. We are going to play the move rook f to b8, once again getting all the pieces into the game. White decides to play the move queen c2, a very flexible option, developing the queen, defending the pawn, defending the knight. We are going to play the move knight to b6, and once again this is a typical idea. This is a more of a typical structure, a setup you need to remember. Knight to b6. The idea is pretty simple. We are attacking the pawn on d5. White tries to defend it with e4, and now just knight f to d7. Coming back with the knight. With knight f to d7, now the bishop on g7 has now opened up. And now the idea is pretty simple. Black can play knight to e5 and once again take control of the d3 square, which I said is once again very weak. The d3 and the c4 square, both squares are very weak. We can put the knight on c4, attack the b2 pawn. Another idea could be push the pawn to c4, get the knight on c5, and once again knight to d3 with the same idea of attacking the rook, bishop and pawn, and black is very happy. So going back, that's exactly what happens if white goes for playing the move h3. Now going back, that's exactly what happens if white goes for playing the move g3 setup. Now if white goes for playing the move e4, we are going to simply take off the bishop, king takes, and bishop g7. Now many of the players would think that it's a bad setup to play with the white pieces, but actually it's very good. And one of the top recommendations from Engine. White plays g3, which is a good square for the king to go on g2, castle up king g2, and once again knight bd7, simply developing all the minor pieces. White gets the rook into the game, and now queen goes to a5, once again getting the queen and the rooks on the queen side, which is a usual idea in the Benko Gambit. White plays the move queen to c2, which looks a very good move, defending the pawn and putting the queen on a very nice square. Now many of the players would be wondering, what if white goes for playing the move e5? Just pushing the pawn to e5. That's it. Attacking the knight and the pawn. Now, one way to deal with this idea is to just take the pawn on e5. Knight takes, and have a trade on e5. And now you can just play the move rook a to d8, which is a very critical move you need to remember. Because if you try to get the other rook to d8, you see the f7 pawn is a bit soft now. And after rook cross e7, if we try to chop off the pawn on d5, knight d5 c4, the idea is pretty concrete. The knight is pinned because the queen is hanging. But here, white can play queen f3. As there is no rook on f8 which defends the f7 pawn, after queen f3 the f7 pawn is simply hanging. It looks like after queen d5, the f7 pawn is well defended. But now there is rook to e8 check. You can't take the rook because the queen is hanging. If you try to play the move bishop f8, I can simply take off the queen. Rook takes, and now the rook is hanging on a8 and white is completely winning. That's the reason rook f d8 is a big blunder. You need to get your a rook to d8. And after rook cross e7, you can take on d5, you can push your pawn to c4, and you can just take the knight on d5. You are still a pawn down, but with some very heavy aggressive play. Like the pawn is nicely placed on c4, the bishop on g7 is opened up on the diagonal. You can get the rook on b5 maybe, putting some pressure on the pawns on the queen side. Who knows, maybe c3 push is a very strong idea and black is pretty happy. It's a draw. Going back, that's one way to deal with the situation. The best way to deal with this situation is to go for a typical idea with knight to g4. Just attacking the pawn. White is having two ideas. White can either take or push, because on the next move we want to take the pawn on e5. If white tries to push the pawn, we simply take it back. If white takes it with the rook, we can play the move bishop cross e3 and we basically win a pawn. Now material wise the position is even. We are attacking the rook. The knight is jumping on e5, putting some pressure. The f-file for the rook is opened up. Black is very happy. It's much easier to play with the black as we are on the attacking side. Going back, if white takes with the pawn, We simply have knight e5 once again. The e6 pawn looks strong, but at the same time it's a bit vulnerable. In the endgame, the pawn is going to fall. We are having the open f file. We are putting pressure on the knight. Once again, black is in the driver's seat attacking. Going back, that's exactly what happens with e6. If white goes for capturing the pawn on e6, ed6, and now it's absolutely fine. We are going to proceed with our normal idea with rook f to b8, getting the knight on e5 with the idea of maybe c4 knight d3, or maybe just put the knight on c4 attacking or putting pressure on the pawn on b2. That's how we are going to continue the position. Going back, that's exactly what happens with e5. If white goes forward with the main idea with queen to c2, we are going to play the move rook f to b8, get all the pieces into the game. And now, for example, now white is having two ideas. What if white allows us with the idea of knight g4, knight e5? And what if white stops us by playing the move h3? First, talking about h3, stopping the idea of knight to g4. We are going to play the move c4 with the idea of knight to c5, which is a very good square for the knight, with the idea of knight d3, attacking the rook bishop. As you know, we need to eliminate the bishop, double up on the b file, attack the pawn. So white tries to develop the bishop, but still knight c5 is incoming. You have to take it, queen cross c5. Once again, black is pretty happy. Now we are going to pull back the f6 knight to d7, and that's how we are going to continue the position. The knight can go to e5, maybe the knight can go to b6, to a4, and that's how black is going to continue. You see, black's all pieces are so active, whereas white's all pieces are so passive. That's how any chess player would love to play the position and love to play chess. So going back, that's exactly what happens if white plays h3. If white allows us with the idea of knight g4, knight d5, we are going to happily do it with knight g4. h3, going back with the knight, takes, and now f4, which makes sense, attacking the knight. We play the move knight to c4, which is a good square for the knight, attacking the pawn on b2. And for example, if white makes a slow move, like king to h2, guess what? It's already losing. We can take the pawn on b2. Benko Gambit is opening where there is full of tactics incoming and you need to be sharp. Bishop cross b2, rook cross b2, bishop cross c3. You have to move the queen. I take the rook and trade all the pieces and win the pawn on a4. And now you can count the material. Black is the one, a pawn up. Black started with a pawn down, but now black is a pawn up. And this is a completely winning position because there are so many weaknesses available in white's camp. Black just need to play h5, h4, get the king into the corner, get the king slowly and steadily, try to push the c pawn, and that's how you are going to win this endgame. And that's how you play the Benko Gambit. So that's how you play the Benko Gambit. I hope that this video was helpful. This opening was very insightful. And if you love to play dynamic and attacking chess, you would surely love to play this opening even at the highest level. And definitely this opening is going to be fun, very easy to play, and you're going to increase your rating a bit too much. So all the best with it. Make sure to watch the games of top players to understand this particular opening much better, much deeply, and improve your overall chess. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you soon, and bye bye.